Wonderful. Thank you. So I'm happy to be here with all of you on this kind of a gray but warm day here in Massachusetts, which is where I am here at the Learning Center for the Deaf in Framingham. So hello and welcome, and thank you to all of my new friends out in Maryland. Thank you for having me. It's exciting to be here and talk about this topic. And on a beautiful Wednesday afternoon, to agree to give up your time to maybe get a little bit uncomfortable in talking and unpacking the idea of linguistic bias and how it may affect people within our work, maybe even cause some inadvertent harm. I really appreciate you all coming here to be here and be willing to kind of open yourselves up to potential bias. We all have it. Nobody's bad for having bias. I think that's the number one thing to put out there right in the front of everyone's mind is that everyone has bias. Having bias doesn't make you a bad person. There's no such thing as getting rid of your bias and being bias free. However, as you'll see as we talk, you can keep your biases in check if you know them. If you shake hands with them and you say, I know you're here, and I know when you kind of creep up on me, and I know that maybe you're not serving me well as I'm trying to serve this family. So it doesn't mean that you don't get to have your own feelings or opinions about things at all. Of course, you are allowed to be a free thinker based on your experiences, your training, etc. But being able to be aware of how your biases may leak into your interactions, be it with families, with children, with colleagues, that can be a very valuable thing to bring to the work that we do, especially with a marginalized community. This is me. You see me on screen, but here I am again. I'm a speech and language pathologist by training. My original training was actually in early childhood education, and then I became a speech and language pathologist. I've been at the Learning Center since 2004. I'm also a certified ASL English interpreter. I'm a classroom teacher. I'm a mother of twins who are 16. We are hanging in there. And I'm also a human. And because I am a human, I'm a person with bias myself. I give talks on bias. It doesn't mean I am the queen of not having bias or that I manage it better than anybody else. I just really like to talk about it with others. And of course, I'm a learner, just like all of you. So this is kind of a two-pronged talk. You see 5 objectives here, but it's really a two-pronged conversation. So the first is going to be talking about the influence of bias on our work, and that pertains to all of us who, whether you're at the watch party or you're joining on Zoom, regardless of our hearing status, age, your level of experience, if you're a student or a veteran in the field, if you're a parent or not, we all have some bias that influences our behavior. And we're going to start to unpack it, and we're going to use something called the BADE questionnaire. So you should have received a link to that yesterday. If not, don't worry. If you didn't get a chance to open it or print it or complete it, don't worry. We will dive into it today and give it a try. And of course, there will be other links and ways for you to access it that you'll see later in the presentation. So if you haven't taken it, if you didn't have time, Lordy, I know that feeling. Don't worry, we'll take it electronically, or you may have paper copies at the watch party, etc. We will have a few minutes where we will take that test or part of it today. If you've already taken it, you can use it as a quick refreshment break, but there'll be a little bit of a timer for that as we get into the presentation. So we'll take that BADE or part of it, give it a try, and it's really just to get a sense of the scale and just to kind of see, do you like it? Can it become part of your toolkit that you use with yourself, with colleagues, even with families, with interns that you might be working with, students who come in to observe, things like that. So the second prong, if you will, is to then take that space that you're in after taking the BADE or thinking about your results. And hopefully that space is one of maybe increased self-awareness or vulnerability, or this idea that, maybe I haven't been as intentional. I work a million hours a week and I have 1,000 things on my mind and I'm just autopiloting and driving through, doing what I do well. Wait, where is my accountability? Where is my intentionality? Hold. This is really your time to pause, all of that other stuff and think about the intentionality that you bring to your work, especially when it comes to bias checking. And understanding and identifying our bias is a big part of taking that accountability for the information that we bring to families and to colleagues every day. But another part is continuing that question of how do I show up when I show up in a space? Looking at how we conduct ourselves in deaf space. That could be if you go into a home with a deaf child, that's deaf space, even if they're the only deaf kid. How you might show up at a meeting with deaf colleagues, that's deaf space. And how we, particularly speaking with hearing providers now, uh, how we use the language of the deaf community being ASL, which is not our language and not our community. How do we maintain a level of reverence and respect by being accountable to our own skill in that language? So when we talk about accountability and awareness of skill sets, the other part of the title, that's what it refers to. All right, so the first thing, people have written volumes of books about bias. So for me to sit here and say I'm going to sum up bias in 50 minutes is just not a thing. So this is a very surface, very much a squish of what bias is as we think about it in the context of this talk. And if you're interested in learning more about bias, which has become a much more popular term in the last several years. I know when I was trained as a teacher, then as an SLP, even as an interpreter, the word bias did not come up much, if at all. It seems like in the last maybe decade, you're seeing, especially with regards to something like anti-bias education, you're seeing the word bias come up a lot more. So that's a great thing. And it's something that's becoming a little bit more popular in our everyday vernacular as educators, as clinicians, et cetera. So basically, if you had to sum up bias in a quick sentence, how I sum it up is that it's our inner feelings that shape our behavior. It's kind of like our little voices that tell us about people and about situations. It can drive how we conduct ourselves, what we say, who we choose to gravitate toward or gravitate away from. It's not necessarily a voice that you're like, oh, I hear you, I'm going to do this. It's subconscious. That's why we're going to be talking about subconscious bias. It's unavoidable. Everybody's got it. Biases actually, they can be healthy. They really give you rules and a structure for how you live your life. Really, the role of bias is it's what your brain perceives as safe. So biases are just your brain's way of trying to keep you safe and whatever you think safety is for you, or comfort, or structured. It gives you a feeling of system and predictability. Bias is often pretty hidden within you until it's not. So, some bias thought bubbles. Hopefully, not things that people would say, maybe in intimate company, you might say these things. Vegetarians are virtue signalers. People who eat meat are cruel. What a terrible accident. Must have been that old guy's fault. She's so pretty. She's got to have a husband. So these are all subconscious ideas that may drive how we look at a situation, look at a group of people, etc. Now, the good thing about bias is you can know it. And if you can know it, you can try to manage it and you can try to mitigate it and you can try to say, what is that? You can approach it with curiosity and then try to unpack, where is it from? Why do I feel this way? What is something that I can do to steer me toward a different line of thinking to understand the other? So we're going to talk about that a little bit more. Types of bias. Excuse me as I go through multiple pieces of technology to make sure I have my notes. It's a little gangly. So you've probably heard of conscious or explicit bias. We don't really need to get into that today because that's outward prejudice. That's purposefully malicious. And I know when I was learning about discrimination and prejudice when I was a kid. We only talked about this. It wasn't until much later in my education where we talked about things like implicit bias, like why a white person might cross the road when a black person is coming the other way toward them, where maybe you're not shouting a slur or running away screaming, but you moved your body to create distance. That's more of an implicit bias. You might not even be aware that you're doing it. You might be aware that you're doing it, and then that would be more conscious. But that's an example. We don't need to give lots of examples of explicit bias. We sadly have many, many examples of that in our daily lives. Implicit or subconscious bias, there's tons of different kinds, some of which appeared in that last slide. So the one about the accident had to be the old person's fault. Well, that's an example of age bias, this idea that old people shouldn't drive. The one about, well, the beautiful woman must be married. Well, that's a gender bias, and that's appearance-based bias. All people perceived as beautiful are partnered. How do we even know that she wants to be married? How do we know that she wants to be married to a man? We don't know any of that, but that's an assumption. She's so beautiful, she must be successful. These are all examples of bias. And we're going to be talking about this type today. So, again, bias is such a huge topic. It's hard to break it down into something that really does it justice. But this graphic here, again, is just kind of my way of how can we think about why bias is and where it comes from in kind of a quick and dirty way. So, bias comes from our experiences, often starting quite young. These little seeds of bias that get planted in us when our brains are young and impressionable and plastic. And they get practiced, if you will, over the years, and they get reinforced over and over again by more experiences and more messages that we get that reinforce those experiences, which is called confirmation bias. And ultimately, biases are their comfort zones based on sameness. And another reason that bias is kind of strong in many of our brains is because our brains like binary thinking. Brains like simple, they like categories. Brains like this idea of, oops, got to go back. Brains like this idea of black and white, this or that, categories. When you get into the gray, there's nuance. It takes a lot more work, a lot more understanding, and our brains go, ugh. It's so much easier when it's just yes, no, right, wrong, two things, right? So bias is based on stereotypes that ingrain in us over time. And it's interesting. I think of my experience growing up in very rural Western Massachusetts. My daily exposure to people was primarily those who were white. They were not college educated. They were cisgendered, lower, middle, or working class. They were straight, conservative leaning. And so that was a very strong and prevalent set of people that I grew up around. However, my parents were from New York City. So my bubble, if you will, was a lot bigger than a lot of the people that I was with geographically because of my parents' backgrounds. So my bubble, my comfort zone, my experiences were very different than a lot of the people that I grew up with. And interestingly, so many of the people that I grew up with are still living in the exact same town. Then 900 people, 300 people in some of these towns, and they never left. And I think part of that, there's a lot of privilege in being able to move upward and outward from rural communities, but part of it is the comfort and the sameness of being in that environment. So what I was talked to as a kid was very different than a lot of the kids that I went to school with. So my bubble was different from others because this bias stems from limited experiences with what you might perceive as the other, right? Your bubble is your family, your friends, your geography, where you went to school, how much you went to school, if you've got a degree or not, the messages we're exposed to, and the messages that we seek out. I'm just going to do a quick check of the chat room. Just making sure that no one has any questions yet. Okay, perfect. I will check the chat room periodically for questions. That's my video phone. Please ignore it. Work never stops. So biases are a safety net from the unfamiliar, and they lead us to stay in these safe zones. So the more we practice being in the bubble, the harder it can be to get outside of it, right? And so that's confirmation bias, as I mentioned before. And of course, social media plays a huge role. So the messages that we click or like or follow on social media, that feeds the algorithm, right? So you end up getting more messages that reinforce how you feel, and it's super strong. And so you just get farther and farther away from what's outside of that scope of thinking, and it gets fed and fed and fed and made stronger and stronger. Confirmation bias is super duper strong. It influences what we seek out, what we avoid, who we talk to, who we might not want to engage with or talk to. And again, it kind of traps you in that bubble. So when does bias become problematic in our work as deaf educators? So maybe you've seen statements like this in action. I hope not, but it's true. We've all seen things like this or heard things like this. Again, these are not maybe outward statements for most people, but they're inner workings deep in their subconscious that drive how they speak with families or work with deaf kids. So, for example, this kind of thought bubble. This is what I know. This is what I can do. So this is what I talk about. And this is what I recommend. Not the other stuff, because I don't know it. I always recommend XYZ thing because that's what I've seen work the most in whatever that person's perception of success or working is. I've been doing this for so long, I don't need to think about something new. This bias that those who have many years of experience under their belt no longer need to learn. This is what I learned at school and what everyone else does, so it must be the most relevant. We just don't do that around here. We don't offer that service, so why would I bring it up? So if one's experiences are limited, either by training, exposure, maybe by fear, that comfort in what is known and familiar becomes seen as the thing that's right and or better than what else could be out there and maybe a better fit for a family that you're working with. And that is when bias becomes problematic. It's when you get insulated into one way of thinking, one way of talking or interacting, one way of making recommendations or referrals, and you really just kind of get in this holding pattern of cookie cutter, same, same, same. And it's real and it's confusing, and we have research that shows us that this is happening. So, this was a study from a couple of years ago. It came out of the UK, and it was a study of deaf kids who were learning two spoken languages. So, it was usually English plus a home language, could have been Spanish, Portuguese, Belgian, French. Some were also learning BSL, British Sign Language. 108 professionals that worked with these kids were interviewed about their progress as multilingual kids. And this is what the researchers found as a result. So those who were audiologists were 11 times more likely than those who were speech and language pathologists to report that kids were linguistically confused or had language confusion. Teachers of the deaf, I was surprised by this. Teachers of the deaf were also 11 times more likely than speech and language pathologists to report reduced proficiency in English and the home language because of bilingualism. So this is really going so far as to blame the home language for delays in the L2, in the second language. Now, this is, of course, really disheartening because we know that language confusion is not a thing, that that's an antiquated term, that children, be they hearing or deaf, are developing multilingually, following really resourceful and amazing patterns of language pooling, code blending. It's not confusion at all. It's actually really amazing for children who are developing multiple languages and showing how that unfolds over time with different people using different languages in different situations. So, what does this tell us? Well, this tells us this is a big problem, right? There's obviously a need for specific training and interprofessional learning to ensure that parents are getting consistent evidence based practice. Looks like we're going to switch interpreters just one sec. Thank you. So, even anecdotally, we know that audiologists tend to hover toward spoken language. Their background is in hearing, right? And in this study, TODs, teachers of the deaf, were skewed toward learning one language at a time. The SLPs, who by training tend to study multilingualism, bilingualism, and child development, from a clinical lens, they tended to have more of that research background and they gave the most research based advice. Now, Claire, the SLP, is not here saying, wow, speech therapists are totally perfect and I've never made a mistake. Oh, Lordy, we know that there are plenty of SLPs who historically and currently are not giving good advice, are giving biased advice, and not doing deaf centered work. In this particular study, these SLPs had a little bit more of a research background, and what they brought to the table was more resources, more understanding of multilingual development, and not so much what what they knew just kind of as people who weren't necessarily research readers, in that particular area, and just kind of going with their gut. Well, your child's using this language more than that language, or they're putting the two languages together, so they must be confused. And unfortunately, that kind of thing, for lack of a better word, it makes families really confused and it's rampant and it's really bad. So on this next slide are things that I have heard from parents firsthand, and perhaps you have seen some of them as well. So we see families caught in the middle of some of this bias and confusion and lack of evidence based practice. Families report that they get little information from their home based EI agency about specialty service providers that support more than one language path. So they feel very steered one way or another, usually based on the comfort zone of their provider, to be quite honest. Families report being actively discouraged from using particular approaches. Of course, we all know the old, well, if you want your child to use their implant, you need to sign less, or you need to stop signing once they're activated. That still kicks around. The opposite is also kicked around. Well, if you want your child to continue to be a signer, you have to make sure that you are not talking to them. It goes both ways. Languages go both ways. The brain is the brain, whether it's auditory language or visual language. Fair weather tolerance between the language camps, so to speak, really not feeling truly welcome in either language space. Fear of deaf community rejection for them and their child. Now, of course, this is far more deep rooted than we can get into in this conversation. Also, as a hearing person, it's not my place to get into it, but this is something that I have heard many times and have had many discussions with my deaf colleagues about this fear of deaf community rejection and why it shows up in parents. Families also report fearing that their children won't fit in anywhere. Hearing world, deaf community, that they're always going to float around in the middle. Oftentimes feeling that their home-based EI is incompetent with regards to deafness and leans toward oral-only approaches as a result. Again, sticking with that provider's primary language or comfort zone rather than what might be best for that family or that child. And what happens often because parents usually have many providers is that they end up with mountains of conflicting information, even from professionals in the same field. So I've had a parent say to me many times, okay, so Claire, you told me one thing, my EISLP told me something else, and the person I work with at the hospital clinic told me something else. What am I supposed to do? And then ultimately, they don't know who to trust because everyone seems biased. And then there is this constant, what I find, especially in these last couple of years since COVID, I have to say, I don't know if people are just a lot more outwards with their feelings after coming out of a pandemic or if things are truly worse. But I have parents tell me constantly, even just this morning, I had two parents. We had four parents come to our playgroup today, a lot of kids out sick. Two of them told me about guilty feelings and fear of messing up and feeling inadequate. It's 50% of my parents that came today talked about guilt and fear of messing up and fear of not knowing if they were ever doing anything right. And they've been coming to us for a while. And they're doing wonderfully. And their children are doing wonderfully. But still, they don't feel confident because they are engaging with people who sometimes are ill informed. And so their feelings of self doubt get bigger because they don't feel like they have a large network of unbiased people giving them research based information and supporting them with that research based information. Bias management, a three-step program. It's really way more than three. But first is acknowledging that it exists in you. The point of this workshop is not to say, I'm going to unpack my bias today and make it go away. That's not a thing. Or, oh man, I have a lot of bias. I'm a bad person. That's not it either. It's really acknowledging that you, as a living, breathing human being, have bias, and then thinking about where it's from, thinking about its impact it can have on your work, and then finally identifying what I'm calling antidotes to your biases, ways that you can keep them in check, ways that you can mitigate them. So if they start to creep up in your conversations with parents, you can say, wait, 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 I know some other things. So let's unearth some of your bias. So some biases are more ingrained or more practiced than others. You may have to dig quite a bit deeper to find them. You may need to have hard conversations with people, people who have observed your work, people that you have worked with, conversations with yourself. So this leads us to the BADE, the Beliefs About Deaf Education Questionnaire. So what is it? It was developed in 2014. So even though it's a little bit older now, it's a survey, a self-survey, and I still find it to be very relevant. We're still dealing with the same issues of language and modality and approach, et cetera, as we were 11 years ago and probably will be forever. So it was created by Gallaudet through their VL2 Visual Language Visual Learning Lab. And it was created because there really wasn't a tool like this before. Research hadn't systematically looked at the attitudes of parents, teachers, administrators about their beliefs and attitudes related to deaf education. There really wasn't a valid measure of looking to see if there was a prevalence in bias and then being able to say, okay, well, these are some areas of bias and these are some possible scores you could get related to these areas. How might they then impact practice? So that's why it was created. So it has a litany of uses from small to large scale. The first time you take it, I call it your bias baseline. It's your first time taking it. And then the great thing about this is you can take it as often as you like to see if your bias changes over time as you gain experience, have conversations, do more unpacking, more learning, etc. It has been used in research on cultural and educational bias effects. You can use it with families. Some families might really dig this. However, one issue is that it's only in English. So if you yourself are proficient in another language or you have a way to get a good translation, you could then, of course, extend this to families who are not English users. It is great to use with college and grad students because these are our new professionals kind of coming into things as, maybe 1 or 2 years ago, they were kind of lay people, and now they're new to the field and they're learning. They might be coming in with the biases that the greater non-professional, non-deaf professional community carries every day. See where they're starting at. New professionals, interns, CFYs for those in audiology and speech and language pathology. It's great for EI professional development. And it's great for the seasoned professional. When I took it, I've been doing this 21 years, and I took it for the first time last year because I hadn't heard about it. And I was expecting I'm going to get XYZ kind of score. I know me. And then I answered the questions and I did the math formulas and I got my scores and I went, oh. There were definitely things that I was like, yeah, okay, I expected that. And there was one scale that I was like, oh, I kind of thought I would score differently on that. Not hugely, but just enough to make me think about, well, why? What made me score like that? Just a quick check of the chat. I feel like that is so much more prevalent because of social media. Yes, absolutely. Especially for the younger people. This is where I age myself. Kids, people, young adults growing up in the digital age, because this barrage of information and messages starts when they're so young, the minute they get a cell phone, right? The minute they start seeing things and clicking and liking and using all the time on these phones, they're getting those messages reinforced constantly. Another comment was, how does one change a hearing parent's bias about their deaf child being successful when the student's school environment leads with negativity and consistent bias against the deaf child? Oh, this leads to deaf students being labeled and referred to the concept of deaf and dumb. Ooh, well, that is just terrible and real. Thank you for sharing this because yeah, that is actually an example of like explicit bias and kind of being married to the implicit bias. And when these things come out and really cause harm, how do you change bias? Well, that's certainly not an overnight process. And it's not necessarily like, oh, let me give you this BADE survey to see if I can change your mind about your deaf kid. It depends on the parent. There might be some parents who are into that kind of thing, but in this, or administrators, some might say, yeah, I'm biased, and this is what I think the world is. So there might be some people who acknowledge and embrace their bias and really have no intention of changing it. And that's not necessarily something that we can change ourselves. That old phrase, you're going to worry about the things you can change, and the things that you can't change, you're just going to try to do your best to focus on what you can. Not to say give up, but that's a definite hurdle. And it's continued education, it's pointing to research. Pointing to research is a huge one. Connecting parents to other parents is a huge one. Does that parent who has bias about their deaf child, do they have other parents that they can speak with? Do they have a support system? Are they connected to something like Hands and Voices, where they can start to have parent to parent connection? That sometimes it can't come from a professional. Sometimes it has to come from another parent, another person in the trench. But that is, if other people want to respond to that question, just so I can move on, that's really big and obviously disheartening that that happens. The school environment is something that we battle every day to make sure that kids have accommodations that value who they are as deaf kids and not just try to erase who they are as deaf kids. And it's one that is, especially post COVID, I find the education and re education of people is way more rampant than before because so many people have left education and we have so many new faces in the field that there's a lot of re-education that needs to take place. Thanks for people who put the BADE in the chat. So the BADE is paper-based. There's 26 questions answered on a 1 to 5 scale. Now it does, in the end, give you 4 bias categories. So you end up with 4 scores. It's free. This is the URL, but it's also in the chat. And if you just Google BADE assessment deaf, it will pop up. And you will also see the research article about how the folks who made it came up with these particular 26 questions. Can you make sure I sent the right one? Yes, that looks like it. Yes, it says BADE package. Yes, I think you did. Thank you, Holly, for that. So some of you took this already. Some of you have not. What we're going to do right now is, I have to give this a caveat. I married a person who's good at technology. So he made me an electronic version of part of the BADE. It's not all 26 questions, but it's enough to give you 2 subscales. I'm not telling you what they are yet because I don't want to bias you. Bomp bomp. So there's going to be a few minutes now for those of you who haven't taken it at all. You can use the QR code. There's a URL down there, and it's going to link you to an electronic version of the test. It's just for this presentation. This QR code will be deactivated in like a day. So if you want to take it again, just get the paper version online. That's available to you forever. So once you finish, I'm going to give just about 5-ish minutes, maybe 4 minutes, just because time. I want to have some time for questions at the end. When you are done, you're going to get this funky looking math formula that looks kind of like what is there on the screen, subscale 2, subscale 3. Just copy and paste that into Google or into your phone calculator, or look, if you have a real calculator, I'm impressed. And you'll get a score between 1 and 5. So in the end, make sure you have 2 subscale scores between 1 and 5. We're not going to talk about what they mean yet. And if you've taken the test already and you've taken the paper version, you will have all 4 subscale scores because the last page of the test has you break it down into the 4 scales and get your scores for each one with a little bit of math. Thank you for taking that time so you could get your scores. And maybe you've already been able to think about them. Before you start or as you're starting, I want to tell you that when I give this talk in person, I've observed many raised eyebrows and furrowed brows while people take this test. Because what are we so trained to think about when we get questions like these? It depends. We say it depends. I don't know. I need more information. When was that kid identified? How long have they been exposed to sign language? Do they have fluent models? When did they get implanted? Are they wearing their CI for at least 9 hours a day? We're so programmed to want every little bit of information, but the point of this is not to create a case study for each question. The point is to read that question and respond with your visceral reaction. If you read a sentence and you instantly go, ugh, then you're probably going to give it a 1. If you read a question and you're like, well, heck yes, no exception, that's a 5. If you feel super torn, that's why 3 is there. And if you say, well, most of the time, I guess, most of the time, but it depends on a few things, you may be leaning toward a 4. So again, this test is not perfect. Nothing is perfect. It's really just a launch pad to start to think about. There's a typo on question 8. So I'll give a few more minutes as I look at question 8. Continue to take it. Oh, yes. So question 8, ASL, because it is a visual language, can map the brain of young deaf, and it should say hard of hearing children. Thank you. There is a typo in there. There's no need to send me your answers. These are really self-assessments. These are for you. I don't do anything with your answers. I'll give it about 1 more minute. And I'll read in the chat real quick. Someone wrote, I think it's important in response to the situation that Joanna described about kids getting referred to as deaf and dumb in really inappropriate school situations. Someone said, I think it's important for parents and guardians to meet successful deaf adults. Absolutely. Absolutely. There are people, as I've learned so much in going to the National EHDI conference every year, that there are some states and some regions of very large states that are really deaf deserts. They don't have large deaf communities. They may have one itinerant TOD who is like kind of a lousy signer, but they don't have any deaf models. And they're driving to all these schools working with all these deaf children, and there really are like no deaf adults around. So it can be hard to connect families with successful deaf adults. So think about, how do you expose them to successful deaf adult role models when you might not have a local deaf school or a local deaf business or something like that? Absolutely agree with the parent connections, deaf mentorship, parent centers, hands and voices, networking, advocate, educate, elevate. Deaf kids can do anything. Totally. How would you approach a deaf, hard of hearing itinerant teacher informing parents to not speak Spanish when we know that language supports language? She only encourages English and ASL. Yes, that is a thing. It's this idea that our brains max out at more than one language or more than two languages. We have plenty of successful trilingual children. Here at the Learning Center, here in the world, children in Europe that speak 4 or 5 languages. It's it's just this constant education that a, a deaf brain and a hearing brain are the same brain. They just get fed a little bit differently because the input modes are a little different. So it's if they want a child to speak Spanish, would they ever tell a hearing child that they couldn't learn Spanish or Japanese or Portuguese, right? No, they would never say, hopefully, they would never say that. All of the research says your child can learn multiple languages, but informing them what that process can look like is really important. That there may be times where the child develops really slowly. The code mixing and the code blending that happens when a child is learning multiple languages, especially if they're learning three, and that languages can dominate and fluctuate. The primary language 1 month might not be the next month, and giving them kind of a, if you see this, it's not bad. This is typical multilingual development. It's that idea of educate, educate, educate. Maybe encourage the teacher to look at multilingual learner literature. Yes, which generally suggests that parents should emphasize communicating in their L1. Yes, thank you. All right, so now I'm going to just continue on. So, literacy through, these were the 4 subscales. So, you did the 2 middle ones if you took this electronic version. So, the 4 are literacy through hearing technologies and or visual support for speech comprehension. So, that's not using ASL. That's using speech reading, cued speech, manually coded English, English-based representing, sign represented in English, English represented in sign, rather. 2 is visual language and bilingualism. This is the ASL folks, the ASL subscale. Next is your LSL, listening and spoken language subscale. And 4, and there's only like 2 questions associated with this subscale. I wish there were more. Difficulties associated with parents learning ASL. So do you in your bias think that hearing parents can learn sign language or not, deep in your soul? So you just did subscales 2 and 3. So, some examples of what scores could mean and where biases are congregating and why. So, if you got, say, a 2.1 on subscale 4, that means you think it's pretty hard for hearing parents to learn ASL. You might not be that inclined to recommend it because you think it's just too hard. Now, why do you feel that way? Because you took it in college and it was super hard for you? Because you don't have, you're not one of those people who picks up languages easily? Is it because you took it in high school and now you forgot it and you're like, or you think, oh, this family's too busy. There's no way. There's no way they're going to be able to learn it. Or I don't know, I had a conversation with that mom. I don't think she's cut out for it. I hate to say that these things are real, but these things are real. Maybe you don't know it yourself to feel like you can effectively service the child. Therefore, that comes out as a bias that you don't think the parents should learn it because you don't know it, or you feel overwhelmed or intimidated, and you fear the unfamiliar. ASL needs to be available to parents at no cost. Preach, says Michelle. But also acknowledging that learning a second language is fraught with privilege, time, money, cognition, able-bodiedness, so many things. My grandma was deaf and she refused to learn ASL because she had done PSE. Mm-hmm. Of course, different generations are going to have bias based on their experience, right? So Kayla's grandma was all about PSE because maybe at the time that she was learning, ASL was not really highly recognized as a language and valued as a language in the way that it is now. It was English, 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 and you will learn English and you will do that through C sign and pigeon sign and queuing or whatever. Let's say you got a score of 4.3 on subscale 2. That's the visual language and bilingualism score. And a 1.7 on subscale 3, which is more the LSL. That means you are leaning more towards sign language and not so in favor of spoken language, at least for most deaf kids. Not like you got a 1 and a 5. You were kind of like leaning heavily toward visual, leaning pretty strongly against ASL. Okay, fine. Why? Maybe you have a lot of deaf friends who were scarred by oral schooling. Maybe you yourself had speech therapists that did horrible things, and that was your experience firsthand as a kid. Maybe you have seen kids get cochlear implants and them really not work. You've seen kids have to get explanted. Maybe you lean very heavily toward ASL because of those reasons. And maybe then you don't make a lot of the referrals that a family might need if they're going to take a bimodal approach. And you may subconsciously keep steering them, even though they're like, we've decided to implant our child. How are you going to service them if your bias is trending you so hard in one direction? So think of if you had any surprises in your results, where are your biases and trends coming from? Is it your training? Is it who you spend your time with? Is it the amount of exposure you have to the deaf community or lack thereof? And then when I talk about antidotes, what can help quiet or reshape your bias so that you can be an intentional provider that can turn those biases off to meet families where they are at? Think about who may benefit from trying this self-assessment, and might you take it again over time to see if things have changed within you. So when I talk about antidotes, it's not about making your biases go away. You are entitled to feel your feelings. Like, it's not that you're not allowed to feel super strongly about ASL or super strongly about LSL. You can absolutely disagree with everything that you might come to learn when you open your mind to the other perspectives or literature or coursework. You are allowed to feel those feelings. But can you keep those feelings in check when a family needs you to give them information or support when it goes against those inner voices or those biases? So what can you do? Take a course. If you got a 1 or a 2 in something, maybe you need to learn more about it. Maybe not, but maybe learning more about it could help you mitigate that bias. Observe the other, as I've been calling it, in action. Have you ever visited a school for the deaf that was bye-bye? Or a school for the deaf that was oral? Schools love visitors. See if you can take a tour. Read the research. I know, it's dry. Read the research. I always say start with the research from Gallaudet, start with the research from Boston University. I think those are great places to start. Social media. Now, I know I said social media is so bad. I am aware. It's garbage. However, there are reputable accounts that you can follow, reputable influencers that you can follow. If you know someone who feels professionally very different from you, ask them who they follow. Take a look. Who do you follow on TikTok or Instagram? Take a peek. Talk to somebody. Ask them, okay, so you're super ASL and I'm super LSL. Like, what's your background? Like, why? Why are you like this? Not in that way. Why are you like this? No, just what brought you to this way of like, what's your training? What's your background? What have you seen? What have you thought about people like me who are on the LSL side or ASL side rather? Ask hard questions and be willing to answer them as well. But most importantly, maintain that sense of curiosity. Your defenses when you have these conversations or you take a class or you go on a tour or whatever, your defenses are going to be ruffled. Try to calm them and be in the moment. Reflect later. Just let the information wash over you. Reflect later, not in the moment. As much as you may want to look like this guy on the left, like, what? Try to take it in. And again, it's okay to not agree with something, but keep that bias in check so you can remain neutral and resource rich in ways that you may not have been before. And with our last several minutes, I want to talk about this other half of accountability, which is knowing your skill sets. So I'm really speaking to other hearing providers out there who are using ASL in their daily work. With deaf children, deaf families, et cetera. There's, of course, as we know, a lot of hearing people who feel quite confident in their work using ASL and may not be very receptive to feedback about their growth. How many times have people heard, well, I'm good enough to sign with a 2-year-old, so as long as I'm one step ahead of them, that's plenty. We've all heard that many times. There are many self-proclaimed, fluent signers out there. Deaf colleagues and friends have told me countless stories of folks with very little self-awareness and how they show up in deaf space, including sessions with deaf kids and their families. And really, it's that lack of reception to feedback. Most of us come into the field completely unrelated to deaf adults with minimal or no real life experience in the deaf world. And then we walk around so many years later saying that we're experts, right? We're guests. It doesn't matter. You could be the most ASL flag waving person on the planet. We're still a guest in the deaf community. And again, as a hearing person, it's not completely my place to say that, but as someone who has had to learn that humility and that reverence coming from the layperson hearing world, no matter how many years you spend, you're still a guest. You never get to say, well, I'm in. Allyship is continuous. It's not something that you get to declare yourself as a hearing person. And this constant self-assessment of how you conduct yourself in deaf space is important. And then knowing your level of fluency in ASL is a big part of that. And do you care to know your level of ASL fluency? And why or why not would you be willing to seek that information out? So part of this is because assessments can cause really big feelings for people. It doesn't matter if it's a math test or an ASL test. A lot of us have pretty visceral reactions to assessments because of a fear of failure, just general test anxiety, fear that you're not going to be able to show what you know, fear of the unknown. Am I going to bomb? I don't know what this is going to be like. And of course, that general fear of having to hold a mirror to yourself. If your results are not what you want, does that mean that you have to do some work? Who's going to find out? Are you going to get embarrassed? That kind of thing can make us avoid these kinds of assessments, but you have to take the risk and acknowledge your accountability to the community. And taking an ASL assessment is a big part of that as a hearing provider. And quickly, I'll just breeze through. And again, this is all in the slides that you guys will get. You'll have access to in the future. I believe they'll be sent out today or tomorrow. Both Gallaudet and RIT have online ASL assessment platforms. Gallaudet's is called the ASLPI. These are all virtual, so you can do them no matter where you are in the country and at any level of sign language proficiency, from the very, very beginner to the hands on fire coda. They're both about 20 to 25 minutes long. You sit down with a deaf interviewer, and basic areas of the language that you would expect to be assessed are assessed. And then your video, which is recorded, is assessed by some deaf evaluators, and you're given a score. So the basic difference between the two tests is the ASLPI from Gallaudet, you get a numerical score. And with the RIT test, which is called the SLPI, the Slippy, as it's sometimes called, gives you a verbal score, a verbal rating score like survival, intermediate, etc. If you, again, Google these, you will find the websites to register, to get more information. I believe they're about $150 a piece or so, maybe slightly more. It does take several weeks to get your results. The cool thing is both websites will give you live samples of what each score looks like. So if you're curious what a 2 plus looks like or an advanced plus looks like, you can see examples of that. Can you send the studies that were used as a basis for the test? Just checking the chat. If you Google the BADE and you get the test, at the bottom is the research study that they use to develop the test, and that will have all of their resources in it. Oh, thank you. Someone said they're in the test. So quick takeaways, because I know we're running out of time and I do see that there's some more in the chat I want to get to really quickly. Bias is a part of everybody, but you can know it and you can monitor it. You have the BADE as a free, quick way to kind of get started. You can use it in small and large scale applications, and you can give it to new folks, seasoned professionals, to check in, to do deep work. Think about the interplay of your bias and then how you talk to families about language planning, about goals. Is your bias taking the wheel, like in that UK study that we talked about? Or is good research your guide? And of course, deaf perspective. Part of knowing oneself, if you are a signing hearing provider, is having that deaf-led assessment of your ASL skills. And we have a couple of those available. Now, they're not cheap necessarily, so speak with your employer about cost sharing. Sometimes there's breaks if you have a group taking these tests. They might have a discount, a group discount. Don't quote me on that, but you don't know if you don't ask, right? So this could be a great thing if there's a group of you who want to go in on it together and say, let's assess our sign language together. Let's all take this test and then see what we need to do about it. Maybe we need to get a group tutor or something. See if there's something your employer will do as a cost share. This is an investment in your families. This is an investment in the kids. So ask, or you won't know. And the whole point is that the more you know of you, the better you serve your families with intentionality. So that takes us to the end with a whole minute to spare. I'm just going to go quickly through the chat for questions. Some people have left some very insightful comments here. Especially thank you for those who are deaf and hard of hearing who have contributed their personal experiences. Biases are not only rooted in our current ideologies, which shapes us, the status quo, which makes it harder for hearing parents who first learn their baby is deaf to have a positive experience, because most parents' sense of normalcy is rooted in the hearing and speaking paradigm. Absolutely. When you have a baby, you make that little person with the expectation that it's going to be like you. And then when you find out there's this huge fundamental difference between you and your child, you don't feel very safe anymore, for lack of a better word. Your world is kind of tipped on its axis, right? And biases are historically intertwined. Absolutely. Yes. ASL and the celebration of deaf culture and intersectional identities are being left behind in EHDI conversation, and deaf people are often guests in the EHDI system. Yes, I have to say that I have seen some improvements in going to EHDI over the years. There's now deaf space at EHDI. There's deaf outings after EHDI, more deaf vendors and more deaf presenters. There was a deaf keynote this year who was a doctor, but it still has a long way to go. Definitely has a long way to go. It's definitely the minority. Thank you for your work on that. Oh, I know someone who's here. That's very nice. Thank you for everyone who has contributed some really wonderful comments to this chat. They're just kind of flying in here, the names of the tests again. You will get a copy of these slides. They will share them with you. My email, oh, there it is. There's my email. And again, it will all be sent out. So if you didn't finish the BADE, the slides will be sent to you. But again, Google BADE assessment, Gallaudet. It will come up.